Okay, so today we finish off our book. We've got these last four chapters. And so starting off on chapter 14, real life is meeting. And Mark, who is a prisoner at Belbury, but has now decided internally, no matter what, he is never going to be taken in again by them. These are enemies. These are enemies of humanity, but also enemies of him personally. And anything they are selling, he is not buying. He is doing what he can to stay alive by kind of going along, a little bit of kowtowing, but it's with every moment looking around and trying to find some kind of way out. He has now been initiated into the knowledge of the macrobes and really understands that there is nothing about that's good. He even challenges Frost just a little about this concept of good and bad, to which Frost, of course, is going to parrot the how this is so far beyond any concept of good and bad. Those are all just animal reflexes and conditions of chemicals within the brain and stuff like that. Um, his philosophy seems to amount to something like whatever happens was the right thing and is supposed to happen. That is kind of a backwards way to be perfectly frank, but that's Frost for you. That's this. Both Frost and Wither represent similar but different outcomes in this not just a materialist philosophy, because now they both understand the presence of the macrobes. Maybe they aren't the strict materialists in that regard, acknowledging some kind of spiritual life, whether they would call it that or not. But basically, once all truth has become fully relative and everything is a phenomenon in order to be observed rather than experienced, then they can take on this artificial objectivity, which, if you are simply an observer to life, then all that you witness, the good and the bad, makes no difference. It's not happening to you. You have no influence over it. You have no responsibility then for it. And some of the worst things can be done when you feel like you have no responsibility. So both Frost and Wither in their own kind of way sort of represent those extended forms of being so removed, so purposefully removed from the concept of truth. As a matter of fact, at kind of Wither and Frost's eventual end, we have this sense of, even then, a potential escape. But they are so trained and conditioned by themselves to reject truth that once again they act purposefully, almost like it's the only habit they have left of being an observer, but to their own destruction. C.S. Lewis was kind of famous in some of his other works, probably the most famous of which being The Great Divorce. But this concept of I think I brought this up early in the book. The door to hell is locked on the inside. If you are in hell, it's because you've chosen it. Now, the concept of choice in this regard is not so much well, I choose that, such as it is, you can train yourself over a sustained period of time to be conditioned, almost developing the reflex, so that you choose when the time comes, whenever that is, in such a manner as it seems to be no choice at all. It's the only thing you can see. It's the only thing you can possibly do. There is none so blind as those who will not see. That's kind of what they're getting at. It is a purposeful choice to be so contrary that all that is left is the contrariness. It has no meaning at that point other than to be contrary. Both of them will be destroyed as a, basically, end product, of this training of their own mind to have nothing left than to be contrary. So we're in this, they call the objective room. This is like the last bit of training so that Mark will be basically ready to be absorbed by the macrobes. Frost and Wither have been kind of competing, which we didn't realize until late, to have basically disciples of their own. Even in the bad, there's kind of a pyramid scheme going on where you want to have somebody underneath you who is kind of subject to you personally. Even though you're subject to these macrobes above you, you wanted to have kind of people on your team, not out of any sort of love or devotion, but almost that sense of, well, when push comes to shove, if I have more people than you have, then I will get some kind of favor that you don't. So we have we've seen that they have their own little acolytes, Strake having been one of them. So now we get maybe a little more of an explanation about why he was so weird and as strange as Strake was. But in this objective room, the training to break Mark's, what they would say, his subjectivity and become that objective observer, like making no judgments, being perfectly neutral, as though you're an innocent bystander to life. And to do that, they show him all of these pictures and images and even the room, and everything is just slightly unsettling. This kind of feels to me like the uncanny valley that we talked about before, where we've got this natural reaction to something that is almost human but not. And when you get too close to being human and you're not human, it's really pretty freaky for us. That's the whole scary doll trope, or the computer animation with its dead eyes, and it looks, instead of looking charming, it looks creepy. And if they had made the same animation a little more cartoony, it would actually be nicer. You would like it more. And here's Mark, and he's got all sorts of images and all sorts of designs and stuff, and it's just slightly off kilter. But it's slightly off kilter in a way where it's forcing him to try to like be okay with it. If you've ever noticed, like you've been in a room and maybe there's a pattern of tile on the floor, but there's one tile off, or a pattern of wallpaper, and you can see where the seam is and it's slightly off center. That's more frustrating for some rather than others. If you're, to the degree you're kind of OCD, that might bother you a lot, but we notice it. Mm-hmm. There's something about the pattern recognition within our brains that notices when things are close but not quite right. A simpler, this is like a, I remember this fashion advice. I am the least fashionable person I know, but I do remember being told once, don't wear black with navy blue. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they're close, but they're off, and you're going to look dumb. Mm-hmm. Wear two navy blues, top and bottom, wear two blacks, top and bottom, or get a observably different color because it actually stands out more when it's close but no cigar. And it's funny that seems to be a part of our wiring of what we notice in the world. Mark, who, unlike Jane, this comes up in a couple of times. Jane was probably raised in the church and had a moment or a period of time where she felt like that was kind of childish, and she puts that away. Now that I'm an academic, now that I'm, in college or whatever, I'm kind of putting that away as that's for children, the bedtime stories. Mark, however, seems to be even a step further disconnected than that, where he maybe never had any kind of faith to explicitly reject. It's been around him, but maybe nothing was ever set inside of him to reject. It's just always been kind of on the periphery. So the best he can do, why does this upset him so much? And if these guys are the bad guys, and I know that, and they're trying to show me these things to unsettle me, that must be for a bad reason. All he can kind of hold on to is his mind coming up with this concept of the normal, the natural, and that something about that is good with a capital G. And what this room is doing is violating that. So he begins to live outside of his body, where this is almost like trying to deal with torture by trying to like kind of disassociate yourself with what's happening to your body. And he starts imagining and thinking about what is natural, and natural is good, and good is right. And all these other feelings and thoughts start flowing back about the regrets in his life for choosing things because he thought they were going to make him more popular or get him in the in crowd, or he was worried about what people thought. We even have a moment very late in this where he is kind of on the way to St. Anne's and he stops in this little inn or something and he finds a book that he remembered reading as a child. But because he hit like his 10th birthday or something before he finished, he had kind of decided, nah, that's for babies. And now he picks it back up again and he's got to finish. And this is really great. How much have I lost by being worried about the dumbest of things? What people think of me, what appearance this gives, whether something that I enjoy is too juvenile or not. C.S. Lewis, who was a writer of children's books in many regards, was a lifelong proponent of fairy stories and fairy tales, children's stories, that good children's stories were good because they were good stories, and that every age could find pleasure and truth in a good story, even the ones that we associate with children. And as a matter of fact, there tends to be a cycle where you read these books for pleasure when you're young, and then you hit some age of adolescence where no, that's for babies. And then as an adult, it almost seems embarrassing. And then you get to a certain age where you just don't care what other people think anymore. And you start realizing some of those simple pleasures were actually quite good. And you start rereading the children's stories all over again. And that's kind of sort of where we are with this. Mark almost doesn't have the language to express this theological awakening that's happening in him. But this is what's happening. Mark, under the threat of death, is now open to the work of God in a way he has never been before in his life. He lacks the language, he lacks the experience to put it in a theological way. But this is absolutely somebody who, for the first time, is seeking truth with a capital T. And even though Mark is kind of a dummy, though obviously very bright and very, very well educated, he's kind of a dummy. We have it on good authority that if we seek, we will find. And if we ask, it will be given to us. And if we knock, the door will be opened. And this is, I think, what is happening inside of Mark. So we have the tramp, the homeless man, who now being left alone with Mark is willing to be kind of a little conspiratorial with them, some winks and some nods. And he seems to think it's, foreigners. That's what these people are, because, and they're trying all these various languages because they think he's Merlin. And so every language they can come up with, every interpreter they can find, nothing seems to work because of course the tramp is just pretending. But when they leave, he's just pretty much thinking, this is a pretty cool day. I'm not outside in the weather and in the cold. They're feeding me. This is a pretty sweet gig. So if all I need to do is to just like not ruin it by speaking, well, then I'm going to let this run as long as I can. And so we have this fun little inadvertent conspiracy between the two of them where they're able to kind of wink and nod and nod to each other while Wither and Frost are still none the wiser at who this guy really is. Now, let's see. We are, I think this is where they were preparing the bedroom in St. Anne's.
Okay.
They are decorating it. There's a name for that. A name for the room, and I don't my vocabulary leaves me. Not boudoir, but kind of an archaic term that meant sort of like the bridal chamber, so to speak. And even almost despite her, trepidation here, even Jane's getting into it and enjoying the fact that they are making this nice and set, and it feels very contradictory. Like the bridal chamber is intended for privacy and intimacy, and here we are like making this kind of a group effort. Isn't that awkward? Isn't it weird? Isn't it kind of embarrassing? And here's Mother Dimple, who's never had children herself, and she's an old lady, and we don't like to think about old ladies and being intimate. Lula and I were going to this non-denominational church in college together while we were engaged, and they offered a group premarital counseling that we went to with several of our friends who were also either engaged or newly married. And so you have all of these basically college age couples, in their early 20s, and there's 5 or 6 of us couples meeting with a singular older couple who was leading this in their home, and it was all curriculum and stuff, but by a very experienced couple who had been married for, I don't know, 35, 40 years. So you've got these folks in their, I would say at the time, they were probably early retirement age. So let's call them mid-60s.
Okay.
And a bunch of very young couples who were in their early 20s. They could have been grandparents. And some of the stuff about communication, perfect sense, about your expectations of roles and duties, okay, no problem. And they got to the bedroom, and we were all just like, I don't want to know. I don't even want to think. And I still remember, I will not say their names. They've probably died by now, but they were sweet people. And I remember her very distinctly saying, honey, we may be old, but we ain't dead. And we all had a kind of a big awkward laugh about that, and then we listened to their advice.
Right.
And their advice was not without its awkwardness. Again, that's like thinking about our parents or our grandparents being mature, married people, and thinking about their nudity and their sexuality is just not what kids want to think about on an older. And yet, this moment and what it will become through the conclusion of the story is, in essence, going back to its holy purposes. What we now, as quote unquote modern people, see as kind of embarrassing or creepy or weird ought to be joyful and beautiful and holy and good. And it's our hangups that make this seem awkward or weird. And the older archaic versions actually had something quite significant, if not good, about them. Now, I'm not saying that I am advocating a sort of first night tradition where the bride and the groom are carried upstairs by friends and family and neighbors and dropped into bed together, and everybody watches to make sure the marriage is consummated. Like, I'm not ready to get there, and maybe that's my hang up. But if this is pointing back to not just an older time chronologically, but an older time theologically, closer to what was intended for us. God is the inventor of sex and of intercourse, and that even holy matrimony is a holy mystery that prefigures Christ's sacrificial love for his church. That in the perfection of Eden, there was man and there was woman, and they were intended to be together, and they were naked together and without shame. So we, with our chronological snobbery, kind of look backwards at the Victorians' hang-ups about things, or older times and ancient times, and they were so clueless, or they were so ignorant, or they were so weird, and losing some of the good and the right and the holy about these older practices that we feel almost like the grown-ups who don't like children's stories. They're too babyish for us. Instead, there was a purity and a truth in that. And even Mother Dimble is a part of this. And it's funny that, Jane has had this late, unexpected vision. And it's of someone like Mother Dimble, but there's a fierceness to it. And that's the dancing dwarves and all the craziness is, which we will see come to its consummation near the end. Mother Dimble wearing what's probably that same outfit that Jane had in her vision. But now, though it is austere, though it conveys a sense of prominence and authority, the beauty and the holiness of it is now what is most obvious. This is, in many ways, and what we will see what's happening in St. Anne's, though the real battle, the battle is the powers and the principalities. And so the people of St. Anne's, their whole job has really been to kind of just be a faithful and observe. But the part that they play, though it seems very incidental, is almost in the, if not retraining, then the recapturing of their right desires. That in the holy presence of God, who he has made us to be, purified and redeemed, to be more of that Edenic or paradise-based truth in expression. This is in his essay, Lewis writes in The Weight of Glory. It's not that God finds our desires too strong. He finds them too weak. We fool around with food and drink and sex when what he is offering to us, this eternal weight of glory, as Paul writes about, is actually our desires finally fulfilled in a way that's deeper and more profound and more satisfying than any of the physical stuff that we might chase in life. And that he finds our interest that we'd be willing to give up without even knowing it, what is truly satisfying, to try to cram down our bodies these sort of baser instincts. He says it's like a child in the slums making mud pies who refuses to stop and to be brought to a holiday on the sea because he has no concept of how much bigger and greater it is than just sitting there in the dirt doing something that seems fun. Our desires are not what's wrong. This desire, this longing within us is actually right because it was placed by God in us. We were built for this. We're just directing it to the temporary, fragile things of life that it was never intended to fulfill it. We find our fulfillment in his presence, not in the stuff. And so much of what will be happening on the St. Anne side of that is the shedding and the laying down of the day-to-day stuff that seems so obvious to us. Well, of course, that's what you do, and that's what you want, and that's how you act. Whether it is the embarrassment, almost the prudish embarrassment about sexuality, to McPhee's insistence that they're not actually accomplishing anything by being there. How do you really accomplish something in a war? You go fight. I need to punch somebody. I need to shoot somebody. That's the only way that stuff is actually going to get done. Nope. Everything about St. Anne's is about, in their obedience, setting down and setting aside their assumptions, which have just been wrong. Not their desire to do the right thing, to do something memorable, to do something big, to do something right. They have just misconceived what their role is. It's directed to the wrong things. And now it's being redirected into the right things, into the presence of Maleldil, into his holy will, into expressing through their bodies, whether it's a dance, that they're now dancing without fear of embarrassment or awkwardness, or whether it's about the coupling that was always intended from the beginning for our mutual aid, comfort, and help. So it's kind of this sort of funny reversal, almost like all the old-fashioned things, whether it's the way they dress or the way they act, or it's starting to rise back up again. And the people of St. Anne's are this is the holy faithful remnant in essence. So when we get to this explanation, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the essence of a land. What's the essence of America? If America had some sort of mythical personification, maybe it'd be like Uncle Sam or Pickles Bill or something. Logres is that ancient, really Arthurian land within England that Britain and Logres are kind of the adversaries to each other. One has kind of the purity of purpose and history, and the other is like that more modern sensibility, the nation of shopkeepers, that kind of thing. And in its absolute worst of excesses, the spiritual nation of Britain is being represented through the Nice and through Belbury, and the spiritual nation of Logres is being represented through St. Anne's. This is a perpetual ongoing struggle. This is not the final battle. They will rise again. The conflict will continue in one fashion or another. And we are reminded by Ransom that this is not unique to England. Every nation has this almost Platonic ideal about, in their uniqueness, God has made us different than each other. In their uniqueness, what in a pure and holy fashion, how would they relate to God? For France, it's the reason, but a true reason which actually leads us not away from the divine, but closer to it. They even liken China, the path of heaven. And if it were actually true and holy, it would lead people, even without the knowledge of the gospel, but closer to the gospel. This spiritual sense of how things ought to be, and there is something almost fundamental in the land itself that God has allowed to occur, to be unique in a different place. But for each one of them, it has been corrupted or spoiled or has some adversarial nature with our own brokenness that tries to take that good and use it wrongly. We might say, um, if the American personification is somehow Uncle Sam, well, the good parts of that with freedom and liberty, the bad parts of it could be military expansion or the sort of freedom that does wrong. Or Pecos Bill, the rugged sense of individuality and adventure. And then the bad could be like violence or removing natives from their land or whatever. So there's always that tension happening between what God intends for us in his good creation and the ways that we screw it up. It's not for nothing then, as we're watching the fate of all of the nefarious people of Belbury, Feverstone meets his fate by creation itself basically swallowing him up. As he tries to run from the calamities happening all around, he gets caught in basically a landslide. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like the ground consumes him. Feverstone, who never cared about anything or anyone other than himself, Feverstone, who could convince himself, as long as he was out for himself, no big deal, what's the harm? And it's almost like creation finally caught up with him. And these little fitting ends to people. Wither, who was consumed by the bear. Mm-hmm. If we were wondering what this great act that Mr. Bultitude, one of the 7 great bears of Logris, and he was going to do something that no bear had done, and blah blah blah. What did he ate Wither? Brother. He ate him. And then Frost basically being consumed in despair like a pagan king of old, where he, throws accelerant on a room and lights everything on fire. And this is just to kind of have a glimpse of the depravity of the malice of the devil. They give Frost his reason back right in the end, just so he can know how terrible his fate is going to be as he burns up. So this is the culmination of everything that has been building steam throughout the beginning of the book. This is God's intended purpose for creation, breaking back through. This is the malevolent forces, the macrobes. This is the Oyarsa of earth, Lucifer, the devil. This is Satan, the spiritual force of the world who has held earth in kind of a siege. He's claimed it as his own. And in a siege, that army is like trapped within their own castle and they're surrounded. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. And within that siege, God has not permitted the other spiritual forces, the other planets, to take a direct involvement here. I'm reminded about the other kind of C.S. Lewis passage that's come up, if not in this book, then in another, about people demanding to see God's presence. Like, I'm a big skeptic, and if God would just sort of show himself, then I would believe, but until he does that, no way. He's got to show himself. And this is the Lewis illustration that be very careful about demanding that the author of the play arrive. Because when does the author of the play step on stage? When it's over. And then it's too late. So, the afraid of rushing in and defeating evil is for our own sake. Could evil be stopped and wiped out? We read the book of Revelation before we got to this book, and the answer is yes. It happened so overwhelmingly. Well, why not before? Well, that's God's grace to give us time. The way it would have been put centuries ago, that God tarries, he pauses as a gracious gift to allow our repentance. If judgment and punishment happened immediately at transgression, there would be no opportunity for repentance and salvation. One of the reasons why we hate the red light cameras is it feels like an instantaneous judgment. Boom. Without any recourse, the camera has clicked, the computer spits out a ticket, and it's already in the mail. There's nobody to talk to. There's nobody to reason with. There's nobody to say, this is why it happened, and maybe get a warning. There's nobody to say, no, the angle was wrong, and that wasn't my car, or whatever it is. So this would, as God pauses or waits or refrains, this is not weakness. This is not inability. This is where true strength is found in refraining from using it. The planets could have been allowed to come down at any time. But it was, nope, we're going to wait. These are the rules. You're not going to break them. And it's actually the macros. It's actually the devil. It's the Yoyars of Earth that tries to sneak away out of this siege. But in opening the door, remember, if a siege is you're surrounded, you don't come in, and I don't go out, and all this kind of stuff. You let the drawbridge come down because you're trying to sneak out. What does an open drawbridge also allow? People to come in. It's basically, you brought this down on yourself. You want to play this? Go ahead. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and in come the planets. We see kind of Merlin's role. Some of it is kind of indirect. We get this nice long sort of play that he does as he shows up as a Basque priest with an obscure language, as there is Wither and Frost are desperately trying to find anybody to communicate to the tramp, and so this is how Merlin basically gets entrance into Belbury. Using his own kind of mystical powers, using the powers of the planets that he has allowed to kind of work through him, whether it is making the tramp speak, kind of like a puppet, or freeing the animals that had been trapped there and experimented on, and then just basically unleashing the consequences of Belbury on itself. What happens to the nice other than the just desserts of everything they were already doing? And then the last vision, basically that Jane seems to have, is of a Merlin whose body is just basically used up. In this last final use of his power, it's almost as though there was just nothing left, and he just kind of poofs into dust. As each of the planets come down, though, that was kind of fun, that the residents of St. Anne's, like basically in a different room, They can't even get close enough to this stuff happening. This is very much like Moses on the mountaintop, that when he came down and his face glowed and the people were so freaked out, they said, "You got to cover your face." In the presence of that much spiritual power and holiness, they have to be separated out on the other side of the house. But with each of these manifestations of the planets that come down, they get kind of caught up in the aura. When Mercury appears, they start feeling very witty. And it's the wordplay and it's the excitement and the sort of things that have been associated with Mercury. And so much of this is going to be, again, it's like all the old stories are true. We just don't realize what the truth was. When Venus comes down, it's this power of love and desire. When Mars comes down, they're all ready to go storm the ramparts. The I admit to, as I read this, and especially that section where you have these spiritual forces, these presences coming down, I always kind of have in the back of my head music from Holst's Planets. Hearing the orchestral embodiment of the differences in the planets. Mercury is very light, it's very fast. Venus feels very serene and very calm. Mars dun, 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 is very militant. Jupiter is just filled with this exuberance, and this power and heft. And I'm hearing this music I know very well as I'm reading some of these passages, and just almost imagining, um, you know, what if we named these things? We thought we were doing them because it made sense. What if they made sense because they were true all along? Jupiter is not just a gas giant of a planet, but there is this sort of eternal embodiment of power and authority and size. And this is Lewis again explaining a different vision of the universe, not just space, which sounds empty, but the heavens, full of the glory of God. So our parallel stories, which have been shifting back and forth between dual protagonists, start to narrow and narrow and narrow. When you are in Orlando, traveling south, you want to go a long way, so you want to take a fast road, like a highway or freeway. The turnpike is very close by. I-95 is very far. You got to go all the way to the coast. You got to go all the way to like Melbourne to pick up I-95 to go south. And as they go south, they're parallel at a good distance for quite a ways. But the further south you go, the closer and closer and closer you get. You get as far south as Jupiter, where State Road 70 is, and you can actually see 95 running parallel through the trees. And eventually they come to a point, and deep in Dade County, they meet. Our protagonist's story has now finally brought them together. And they meet together, both of them kind of embarrassed at how they've sort of wasted their lives and each other to date, and worried that the other might reject them. And all the while they have been prepared by God for one another, and will finally have the marriage that they should have had and was intended for them. This will be, for the first time in their lives, holy matrimony, which is why the bridal chamber was not for Ivy Maggs and her husband all along. It has been for them. And this will be the first night of a brand new life. Now, that is our conclusions. I mean, it's actually the very last thing that happens in the book.
Yeah.
We don't actually see anything other than the reunion about to happen. Almost Jane about to put her hand on the doorknob and walk in. Well, we can certainly extrapolate what will happen next, but everything else has happened to get to that point. Belbury has been destroyed. The wicked have kind of met a very ironically appropriate fate. This is the just desserts kind of thing. And Mark is being brought inescapably back to a wife that he now desires with a purity he can't even put his finger on, but he now knows is right and true. And he only hopes that he is actually worthy of something so good. And same thing as Jane does too. It is not for nothing that as at the end of all things, what we see kind of throughout the house and the area is this coupling. Part of that is Venus, is Paralandra, her presence coming now, not just for the battle, which is now complete, but to bring ransom back to her, has now kind of formulated, it just started all of this romance, basically. And so it's even the animals, everything from the hedgehogs in the walls to an elephant, and the elephants who've escaped from Belbury, and seeing that it's not embarrassing or crude, but it seems this is the purpose of life. It is both the consummation of the story, it is the consummation of these species, it is the consummation of what our desires ought to find their fulfillment in, rightly and truly. And so as the book ends, as evil is defeated, this is not a final battle. There's a reminder that this has been happening for a long time. Even though Ransom stands in the place of the Pendragon, there's actually been hundreds of these guys over the years. A history happening unbeknownst to us, but all around us, of which this is a very very striking moment that was significant and important, but it wasn't the first time and it won't be the last time. But these in smaller ways, this is like a Cold War battle, which will continue on into the future with the next Pendragon to be named. And the fight against the spiritual forces of this world that seek our own destruction will continue. But for today, Logris has won, good has won. The people are brought closer to Maleldil. Ransom offers that blessing again and again and again as both an affirmation of victory, but also a promise of a future, because this is not the end. It is there is now yet another beginning about to unfold. Any questions? Any further? It is a very beautiful story in many ways. Crazy that we've gotten to this point. Who would have thought by the first chapter that we would be talking about the spiritual presence of Jupiter coming down to possess the body of Merlin and cause a bear to eat the deputy director. I mean, all this stuff, it's just kind of gone out of nowhere, but this is at the end of all things, God's goodwill is done, and it's done in ways that actually make us more human, and for creation to not be destroyed, but purified, and more like it should have been always from the beginning. That is a universe then that is not empty space, but the very heavens of God that point to his eternal glory. Okay, and that is it. So thank you and anybody else watching. very, very much.